My family kicked my 7-year-old daughter and me out during Christmas dinner. You should leave and never return, my sister Victoria said. This house is so much better without you, my mother added. You are a stain on our legacy. I did not beg, I did not cry, I just said. Then you will not mind me doing this. 5 minutes later, they were begging me to undo it. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I turned away from the dining table, but I did not head for the front door immediately. I walked with clinical precision toward the kitchen cupboard at the far end of the counter. I could feel Victoria watching me with her practiced influencer smile. That mask she wore to look reasonable while she methodically stripped away my dignity in front of the entire family. My mother, Susan, dabbed at her mouth with a linen napkin, treating this calculated abandonment of her own daughter as nothing more then a minor scheduling conflict. They expected a breakdown. They expected me to audition for their love one last time, to beg for a seat at a table that had never truly been mine. What they did not know was that I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long. I reached into the back of the cupboard and pulled out 3 heavy, white envelopes. These were not holiday cards. They were the legal documents for the $1,200,000 debt assumption. I had prepared them to save this estate from foreclosure, to bail out my father, Ryan, and my brother-in-law, Tyler, from the financial wreckage they had created. I stood there for a beat, looking at the names scrolled on the front in thick black marker. For years, I had lived in a prison without bars, bound by the invisible chains of a survivor. I had normalized their cruelty because I thought loyalty was a contract you could never cancel. No matter how many times they defaulted on their love, I thought if I just provided enough financial life support, they would finally see me as an equal instead of a burden. Anger was not loud this time, it was clinical. I took the first envelope, the one labeled for my mother, and I tore it straight down the middle. The sound was sharp and clean, echoing through the silent dining room like a gunshot. My father's eyes finally lifted from his plate, his face tightening as his brain finally began to load the weight of what was happening. Then I tore the second one, slow and clean. That was for my father's signature. Finally, I tore the one for Victoria. This was not a tantrum, it was accounting. I dropped the pieces onto the counter in 3 neat piles, like offerings at an altar for a god that no longer existed. Victoria scoffed, her smugness cracking only at the very edges. She told me I was proving their point, that I was being dramatic and unstable. Susan shook her head, watching me as if I were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. They were not shocked by what they had done to me. They were shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. I did not argue, I did not explain. I turned and saw Emma standing in the hallway already in her coat, her tiny backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked up at me with wide eyes, but she did not look surprised. She had been carrying the weight of their exclusion for 7 years, quietly counting her peas while the air in the room grew sharp. I took her hand and walked out the front door. The cool Virginia air hit my face, the kind of cold that makes your lungs wake up. As we reached the car, I glanced back through the window. I saw them leaning over the counter, pressing the torn pieces together like a puzzle, their faces transforming from smug to confused, and then to a pale, frantic panic. The door flew open behind us. Abigail, wait, Victoria shrieked, come back, please. My mother's voice cracked with desperation. 5 minutes ago, they had told me the house was better without me. Now, they were begging me to reverse a reality they still could not admit out loud. I slid into the driver's seat. Emma climbed in beside me, and I drove away into the dark. Emma did not say a word as we pulled out of the long, winding driveway, the tires of my car crunching over the gravel of the estate my ancestors had built and my parents had nearly destroyed. I kept my hand steady at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, watching the rearview mirror as the warm, golden lights of the dining room faded into the distance. Inside that house, they were likely still leaning over the kitchen counter, trying to piece together the paper trail I had just incinerated in front of their eyes. They were looking for a way to salvage their pride, but what they were actually looking for was a way to salvage their bank accounts. I had been the architect of their comfort for 5 long years, while Victoria was busy curating her influencer feed with designer bags and manufactured sunsets. I was the one quietly wiring $500 every single month to a special account my father told me was for his medication. It was not for medicine, it was the interest payment on the $1,200,000 debt they had hidden from the rest of the world. I knew because I am an architect. I look at blueprints every day, and I see the structural failures long before the walls start to crack. My parents treated my career as a little hobby, a phase I was going through to keep myself busy after my husband died. They called my work freelancing, as if I were just sketching pretty pictures in my spare time between counting pennies. They never bothered to ask about the projects I led at Thornberry Systems or the fact that my base salary was now $110,000 a year. They did not want to know the truth. if they acknowledged my success, they would have to acknowledge that they were surviving on the charity of the very daughter they called a stain on the legacy. I remember one Tuesday afternoon, 2 years ago, sitting in my studio apartment eating ramen noodles while I looked at a photo Victoria had just posted. She was on a private beach in Tulum, thanking our wonderful parents for the surprise trip. I looked at the confirmation email for the $500 I had just sent to Susan for her supposed tax bill. The math was simple and cruel. I was the one paying for the beach, the drinks, and the smiles Victoria was selling to her followers. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and tonight, I had finally closed the account. We pulled into the parking lot of a quiet hotel on the edge of the city. The lobby smelled like pine needles and silence. As I unbuckled Emma from her seat, she looked at me with a clarity no 7-year-old should possess. She asked me if we were ever going back. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon even a flicker of regret, but there was only a clinical, freezing clarity. No, I told her, we are finished auditioning for people who decided our worth was based on their convenience. This was not a breakdown, it was a balance sheet, and for the first time in my life, the numbers finally favored us. Everything stayed silent for exactly 30 minutes, then the digital lynching began. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, watching my phone glow with a different kind of fire. Victoria did not waste a second. She posted a series of stories, her eyes artfully red from supposed tears, framing me as the mentally unstable widow who had attacked our parents on a holiday. She told her 50,000 followers that I was having a breakdown, that I was jealous of her success, and that I had destroyed a precious family gift out of pure spite. The messages from extended family started pouring in within the hour. Cousins I had not seen in years and aunts who only called when they needed architectural advice were suddenly experts on my mental health. They called me selfish, they called me ungrateful. One uncle told me I should be ashamed for treating Susan and Ryan this way after everything they had given me. I realized then that my family had fallen into the trap of cruel normalization. To them, my exploitation was not a tragedy, it was the baseline. They had spent years convincing themselves that my architectural salary was just extra money that belonged to the collective. While Victoria's earnings were her private prize, they did not feel like they were stealing from me. They felt like they were just managing a resource that had grown too large for one person to handle. Their entitlement was a wall I could never talk through because it was reinforced by decades of habit. Then my phone buzzed again. It was Susan. I answered, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to hear the exact pitch of her delusion. There was no apology, there was no concern for where her 7-year-old granddaughter was sleeping. Abigail, she said, her voice hard and brittle, you have created a massive mess. Victoria is hysterical. Your father is at his limit. You are going to come back here tomorrow and you are going to fix those documents. You will sign them, or you can consider yourself dead to this family. I did not yell, I did not cry. Anger was not a resource I was willing to spend on her anymore. I simply told her that the documents were gone, just like the $500 a month I had been sending her for her supposed medication. I told her to look at the piles on her counter and realize that those pieces of paper were the only things keeping her from losing the estate. Good night, Susan, I said, and I hung up. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I was no longer a daughter, I was a plaintiff. I did not return to my parents' estate the next morning, nor did I check into my office at Thornberry Systems to hide behind blueprints and structural calculations. Instead, I drove to the highest floor of a glass and steel building in downtown Richmond, the kind of place where the air smells like expensive stationery and the high-definition cost of a mistake. I was done being the silent investor in the failing enterprise known as my family. It was time to hire a professional liquidator. Grace was exactly what I needed, a high-end estate attorney who looked at life through the same clinical lens that I used to design skyscrapers. She didn't offer me tea or a sympathetic tilt of the head when I told her about the Christmas dinner or Victoria's digital smear campaign. She simply opened a fresh legal pad and asked for the numbers. I realized then that my compassion had been a luxury my family had overdrafted for years, and tonight, I was here to settle the ledger. We spent 3 hours de-romanticizing my childhood and the 5 years since my husband died. I laid out the bank statements, the wire transfers, and the screenshots of Susan's desperate texts for help with her mortgage. I showed Grace the $500 I sent every month. Money that was supposedly for my father Ryan's life-saving medication but was actually the subscription fee for my own abuse. We reclassified every gift as an informal loan. We turned every sacrifice into a line item. In this office, family affection was no longer a bond, it was a contract they had breached. Grace initiated a full forensic audit of my late husband's estate and all associated family accounts. I wanted to see the architecture of their greed from the inside out. I instructed her to draft a formal legal notice for the immediate repayment of every cent I had funneled into that estate under false pretenses. The total was nearly $100,000 in direct transfers alone. They have 30 days to initiate a repayment plan, or I will begin the process of legal seizure. I am an architect. I know that when a foundation is as rotten as theirs, the only responsible thing to do is to tear it down and start over. As I walked out of the firm, I felt a lethal precision I had never known. I didn't answer the 17 missed calls from Tyler or the venomous emails from Victoria. I went back to my laptop and watched my spreadsheet glow in the dark. They weren't shocked by the cruelty of what they'd done to me and my 7-year-old daughter Emma. They were only shocked that I had finally stopped playing the role they assigned me. This wasn't a breakdown, this was a balance sheet, and I was finally the one in control of the ink. Grace called me back into that high-definition office 2 weeks later, but the air felt different this time. It was no longer just about interest rates or unpaid informal loans. She laid a single manila folder on the polished mahogany table and didn't say a word. I opened it and saw the architecture of a crime. The audit had uncovered a paper trail that ended in a $1,200,000 land sale. This was property my husband, Daniel, had purchased years ago as a legacy for our daughter, Emma. According to the documents, I had signed off on the sale only 3 months after Daniel's funeral. The problem was, 3 months after the funeral, I was barely functioning enough to sign a grocery receipt, let alone a $1 million contract. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a masterpiece of deception. To a stranger, it looked exactly like my handwriting, but I am an architect. I spend my life analyzing the precision of lines and the weight of strokes. This signature lacked the natural flow of my hand. It was a cold, calculated replica. My lawyer pointed to the notary stamp on the back. It belonged to a firm where my brother-in-law, Tyler, was a senior partner. The audit proved that my father, Ryan, and Tyler had orchestrated the sale behind my back while I was drowning in grief. They didn't just call me a burden while I was sending them $500 a month. They had actively stolen my daughter's future. They had embezzled $1,200,000 meant for Emma's trust fund and used it to prop up their failing business and fund Victoria's manufactured luxury. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was lethal. I stared at the forged signature sitting next to a framed photo on the desk of my father holding baby Emma at her first Christmas. The contrast was a clinical demonstration of their pathology. They weren't just ungrateful, they were criminals. This wasn't family drama anymore, this was a kill shot. I didn't call Susan to scream, I didn't text Victoria to argue. I looked at Grace and told her to finalize the criminal complaint. I wanted every document, every forged stroke, and every dollar accounted for in a way that the law could not ignore. 5 minutes ago, they were my family. Now, they were just another structural failure that needed to be cleared away to make room for something solid. The doorbell to my office did not sound like a warning. It sounded like an appointment I was finally ready to keep. I watched Susan and Ryan through the security camera, standing in the lobby of my new independent firm. They looked significantly smaller than they had at the estate in Virginia. Their expensive wool coats hanging loose on frames that seemed to have aged a decade in just 2 weeks. In Susan's hands was a cake, decorated with a superficial sweetness that was meant to act as a prop for her performance of a grieving mother. They were not here out of a sudden realization of love, they were here because the forensic audit had finally reached their private bank accounts, freezing the last of their stolen resources and triggering the bank's final foreclosure notice. I did not invite them past the glass doors of the lobby. I remained standing, a physical barrier between them and the life I was building for my 7-year-old daughter Emma. Susan held up the cake like it was a peace offering that could somehow undo 5 years of financial and emotional exploitation. She used that soft, trembling voice I used to mistake for compassion, telling me they had all had time to cool down and realize we were still family. "We miss you, Abigail," Ryan said, his voice lacking the usual sharp, commanding edge of his authority. "The house is so quiet without you. Let us just fix this mess so we can all move past it." I looked at them, and for the first time, I saw the power illusion of an empty wallet. For 28 years, I had perceived their status and their disapproval as an absolute force of nature. I now realized that their authority was a rental, paid for with the very resources they had methodically stolen from me. Without the $1,200,000 they embezzled from my late husband Daniel's land sale, their legacy was just a structural failure waiting for the wrecking ball. They were not shocked by the cruelty of their own actions, they were only shocked that their cash cow had finally stopped playing the game. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single document. It was not a signed debt assumption or a check to save them from ruin. I slid the criminal complaint for embezzlement and forgery across the polished granite counter toward them. The transition on their faces was a clinical study in narcissistic injury. The mercy they were begging for was just another transaction they could no longer afford. "I already did something I regret," I told them, my voice calm, factual, and lethal, and it was not tearing up the papers at Christmas. It was believing that you were my family for a single second longer than I should have. I stepped back and locked the electronic doors. For the first time in my life, locking someone out did not feel like cruelty. It felt like protection. Their power was a ghost, and I was finished being haunted. The legal gears turned with a cold, relentless grinding that I no longer felt the need to monitor. Tyler faced disbarment and criminal forgery charges, while my parents watched their manufactured legacy evaporate into foreclosure auctions and public disgrace. I used the recovered $1,200,000 to establish a foundation for single mothers in engineering, building a blueprint for others to escape the same invisible chains I once wore. Letting go of my bloodline was not a betrayal. It was the final, necessary act of finding myself. We now live in a modest, sun-drenched home where Emma no longer counts the peas on her plate. She counts the flowers we plant in a garden that belongs solely to us. I realized that the best revenge isn't destruction, but becoming everything they said you couldn't be while they are forced to watch from the ruins of their own greed. I grieved the family I thought I had, but I saved the daughter I actually have. So, tell me, did I go too far, or not far enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share this with someone who needs the courage to set their own boundaries.